the Greek Symposiums, Jesus' Last Supper, Woodstock, all parties that changed the course of history. It's one thing to throw the greatest party of any given city, college, or state, but to throw a party so grand that it makes the history books is a goal too lofty for even the more ambitious rager. One such party occurred in the history of the Walt Disney Company that was not only infamous for its wild nature, but also for its occurrence at a turning point in the company's history.
It's an animator's retreat. 1 week away, we're not mistreated. We were planning a protest. Been 5 months of sleeping under my desk. But for now, I'll rest my eyes and dream about how we're gonna unionize. Maybe tomorrow, when I wake, I won't realize I made a huge mistake.
It was a wonderful time. People coming from all over. They were funny guys. They were offbeat. It was a lot of fun. We were all young. It was great. There wasn't anybody you couldn't go to ask for help. It was just one big, happy family.
In late 1934, animators from Walt Disney Studios gathered after hours at the studio's headquarters on Hyperion Avenue in Silver Lake, Los Angeles. Only a select few of the company's over 200 employees were asked to come in for the presentation, to be given by Walt Disney himself. The meeting turned out to not only be the announcement of the studio's biggest project yet, a feature-length adaptation of Snow White, but it was also a performance, with Walt acting out the story's scenes and giving life to some of its characters. The 3-hour presentation was incredible and inspiring, and Disney's animators were motivated to take on what would certainly be a huge risk for the studio. Up to this point, Disney was focused on animated shorts and comic strips, so a feature-length animated film would be a huge step for the company, while his brother Roy, along with lawyer and counsel Gunther Lessing, dealt with the business complexities of such a risk. Walt put together a story department for Snow White, and began working with his growing staff to produce the film. Disney was often described as the conductor, with his artists being the orchestra. While he was not a skilled animator or cartoonist himself, no one could deny Walt's abilities as a storyteller. He had a strong sense of what the audience wanted, and he was present in every step of production, critiquing each frame until the product was just right. Despite this working relationship being compared to a sophisticated orchestra, the working environment at the studio more closely resembled a fraternity. For one, the animators were young. Many were joining the studio straight from art school, so many of Disney's employees were younger than 25 years old. These boys were hard workers and talented artists, but they were also kids. They could be rowdy, and a collective brotherhood of humor and fun soon formed in the studio.
Pranks? Some of it was pretty standard. We'd balance a cup of water over a door to drench someone when they opened the door. One time someone put a roll of animation paper up there. That must have hurt when it fell.
On their lunch break, the animators would often go to the nearby Griffith Park to have a few beers and play football before returning to work for the afternoon. One animator, Fred Moore, would develop a reputation for drawing images of naked women that he would refer to as Freddy's Girls. Moore also had more than a few drinks during the day, and some referred to him as a functioning alcoholic. Another animator, Ward Kimball, would become well known in the group for being not only a great artist, but a fantastic musician. The accomplished trombonist would even recruit a few animators to join a unique jazz band. It was common for the group to meet up outside of the studio. A few would even take art classes together to improve their skills. Animator Art Babbitt felt that he had a better idea. Babbitt had joined Disney Studios in 1932, and his presence was immediately felt. He had a big personality, and he was a talented animator. In his first year, he would take a minor character named Dippy Dog and develop him into the popular Goofy. Babbitt was also a well-known womanizer.
My attitude was, if it moves, screw it.
Babbitt felt that the animator's practice time would be better spent outside of the classroom. He would take it upon himself to host his own classes in his home, where he would pay models to pose nude for the artists. Word quickly got out about the drawing sessions, and Babbitt's house was soon filled with artists, most of which were not formally invited. Walt soon found out about these meetings and took Babbitt aside.
Suppose it got in the newspapers that a bunch of Disney artists were drawing naked women in a private home. It wouldn't sit very well.
Walt was happy that his animators were excited to practice their skills, and he offered Babbitt the studio space for the sessions. Solidifying this fraternal working environment was the studio's structure. At the time, Disney Studios was segregated, not racially, as Disney would not hire a full-time African-American animator until 1957, so in a certain sense it was, but also, it was segregated by sex. The animation process was separated into different departments, mainly the key animators, who would draw the key poses of the animation, the in-betweeners, who would draw the frames in between the keys, the ink and paint department, who would ink and paint the drawings, and the camera department, who would capture the frames on film. All of these departments were made up of men, except for ink and paint, which was composed of women. These women were performing a task that required a high level of precision and artistry. They were paid the least and received little to no credit for their work. But the boys in animation appreciated them a lot. There were rules against inter-office relationships, but these only applied to the legitimate courtships between the animators and the ink and paint girls. On top of being ineffective in their sole purpose, these rules did not account for workplace harassment, as this concept was still decades away from entering the mainstream. This was also prior to women entering the workforce in droves. Had the animators been accustomed to working in tandem with women, in theory, there would have been less harassment. This theory was soon disproven every day for the past 80 years. At Disney Studios specifically, the attitude towards the ink and paint girls from the men was so obvious that it would make its way into an employee manual a few years later, in which an illustrated animation boy and an ink and paint girl are seen walking around the studio. And in almost every single image, he is seen gawking at her. Every single image. Except for this one, where he's gawking at a waitress. Walt felt that this workplace culture was unacceptable, mostly because it slowed down the boys' work, so he did his best to put a stop to it.
You know, at the studio, there was a strict dress code in those days for employees. Women were not allowed to wear pants, and sober-colored shirts and blouses weren't very appealing. The ink and paint girls were separated from the animators. The Disney brothers had sent out a memo that if you were in animation, you weren't supposed to dip your pen in the company's ink and paint, which was their way of saying, behave yourself with the ink and paint girls. If you told a dirty joke within earshot of Walt, you might get fired. He didn't put up with any of that stuff.
Walt might have drawn the line at dirty jokes, but he had a hard time enforcing the restrictions on inter-office relationships. It wasn't long before couples formed, and multiple marriages came not long after. Claude Coates, Ken Peterson, Ward Kimball, and more would find their wives in the studio, most from ink and paint, and the amount of relationships would rise as more people were added to the studio to work on Snow White. One of Walt's managerial talents was his ability to hide a threat within a joke, as he would do whenever an inter-office marriage would occur.
I had gotten married. I married a gal named Dorothy Powers. She was a supervisor in the ink and paint department. The first words from Walt were, "I'm supposed to fire one of you two people." Of course, that was very discouraging.
Even with his passive aggressiveness, Walt found little success enforcing the relationship policy. After all, he had met his wife Lillian in the ink and paint department, so he could only say so much. While there was still the physical separation of the men and women at the studio, there was one non-secretarial girl consistently with the boys in animation, 14-year-old Marge Belcher. The young dancer had been selected to model as a reference for the character of Snow White, and the animators immediately welcomed her into the family. Due to her age, many of the boys saw her as a little sister, but not Art Babbitt. Babbitt pursued her romantically, and the two began seeing each other. Walt himself was so upset at the situation that he was preparing to fire him when Babbitt announced that they were getting married. They would be wed in the summer of 1937, when Belcher was 17 and Babbitt was 29. Walt saw this fraternity of boys as a family, but as endearing as it may appear, it was Walt's version of family. Walt's father Elias had instilled in him a tireless work ethic and rarely praised his work, and Walt brought these philosophies to his family at the studio. Animators were expected to work long hours and under Walt's perfectionist eye. Walt also fancied himself a mentor, a man that had conquered life and was ready to pass his wisdom down. He had put in years of manual labor on the Kansas City paper route, had served in World War I, had seen success and failure in animation, and had even suffered defeat with the loss of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, only to find triumph with the creation of Mickey Mouse. Walt believed he had done it all at the young age of 32, but it should be noted that the average life expectancy at the time was only 58, so wisdom had a lower cutoff. Since his staff were almost all younger than him, he viewed himself as a familial superior. Not necessarily a father, that position might have been better attributed to his brother Roy or Gunther Lessing. Walt was something more inviting, an uncle. This would later become his relationship to the United States as a whole, but in the mid-1930s, he saw it as his relationship to his staff. Reportedly, Walt even asked Marge to call him Uncle Walt as she modeled in the studio. The initial inspiration of Snow White quickly turned to determination, and soon after to desperation for everyone involved. For Walt, it was a huge risk. He took on a significant financial burden himself, liquidating many of his personal assets to fund the film. For the animators, it was grueling work, with most of the film's staff working 12-hour days and often 7-day weeks. The entire studio sprinted to the finish line, and once the film was complete, the staff collectively collapsed from exhaustion. But it was clear that they had created something special. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs would debut in theaters on December 21st, 1937. The film was obviously a hit, a box office juggernaut, and a cultural phenomenon. Disney's risk had paid off, but he was left with an exhausted workforce. Walt needed to lift spirits quickly, as he was already beginning development on 2 more features, an adaptation of The Adventures of Pinocchio and an adaptation of Bambi: A Life in the Woods. The first thing that Walt did was gather the funds for bonuses. All of the employees were to receive the equivalent of 3 months' salary. Walt also announced that the studio would switch to a 5-day workweek, instead of the official 5.5-day, and much better than the unofficial 7-day workweek. On top of this, everyone would be given a 2-week vacation in August of 1938. Finally, Walt planned a weekend retreat for his staff to celebrate the film's completion. Everyone expected some sort of wrap party after Snow White, and many were looking forward to a night of drinking and dancing. However, Walt's vision of the party had a much different tone.
Snow White was a huge hit. You can't believe how big it was. Walt and Roy announced they were going to throw this huge, incredible thank you party for everyone who worked for them. Wives, husbands, friends, all of them were invited to a weekend at the Narconian Hotel on Lake Narco. All costs, from the rooms to the food and drink and whatever we wanted to order, would be taken care of by Walt.
Located in Norco, California, a town about 50 miles east of Los Angeles, the Lake Norconian Club had opened just 8 years prior on February 2, 1929. The Norconian was a beautiful resort that drew Hollywood's elite right from its opening. With swimming pools, a golf course, and a gorgeous hotel, it was both a relaxing getaway spot and a lucrative filming location. After closing for 2 years during the Great Depression and reopening, the Norconian had enough facilities and activities to host large-capacity events, and it was a perfect location for the Snow White wrap party. After selecting a resort capable of hosting tennis, golf, swimming, horseback riding, and more, Walt decided to theme the party to a field day. A field day, or sports day, is a day in which school children are allowed outside of the classroom to compete in physical activities. With the event, Walt was allowing his animators outside of the studio to do the same. Walt even had a few of his employees make up a themed program for the weekend. The front cover of the brochure would display Mickey Mouse holding a golf club and looking at the viewer. This was significant, as this was the first time that Mickey was drawn with pupils.
In order to have Mickey's head addressing the ball and at the same time smiling at the audience, I said, what the hell? I'll use our regular eyes that we're using on everything else and put black pupils in them. This really caused a riot in the comic strip department. The next week, a few of the comic boys, Al Taliaferro and Floyd Godfredson, came running in and they said, is this the way you guys are drawing Mickey now? We kind of played it cool and smiled and said, maybe. Fred Moore agreed that it gave Mickey more personality. Mickey didn't have to roll his little black ovals out to the edge of the big eye boundary to get expressions. Since Fred had just convinced Walt to accept Mickey cheeks that bulged with the dialogue movements, Walt also bought the new eyes.
Walt provided detailed instructions for his field day, including directions for the hour-and-a-half drive to the resort and wardrobe recommendations. There was also a clear guest policy. Every employee was allowed one guest, but if you were married to someone in the studio, that was your guest. Proof of the prevalence of inter-office relationships. The main events would take place on Saturday, June 4th, 1938, and employees could stay the night before and/or the night of at the hotel, with the reservations being booked by the studio in advance.
Walt took over the Narconian Hotel. The first floor hosted the unmarried guys, the second floor the unmarried girls, and the third floor the married employees.
The instructions made the party sound, for lack of a better word, uncool. In response to the formal instructions, a second memo was created and handed out as a prank, poking fun at the event as presented by the studio. It contained a reference to the inter-office relationship rule, claiming, quote, married couples within the studio, we're sorry to say, should consider each other as their one guest for the day. In other words, it serves you right. It also made fun of the event's theme, sarcastically offering the synonyms Strawberry Festival and Quilting Party. Another section noted that, quote, all fillies should come in slacks or other very informal attire, or, quote, you won't have much fun, which was probably the exact type of harassment Walt was failing to stop. The prank memo also reminded the animators to prepare for a night of drinking and partying. Walt's memo did not focus on the brewskis, it was more concerned with the day's field activities. Walt's field day was to include pitch and putt, badminton, ping pong, and horseshoes, and that was just the beginning. Literally, because those were the events from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Lunch was at noon, and detachable meal vouchers were placed within the brochure. The day events sounded fun and fit well within Walt's theme, but everyone knew that the real party would begin after dinner at 7, because at 9 p.m., it was time to dance. the studio headed for the Norconian with different expectations for how the weekend would go. But both the studio management and the animators were excited nonetheless. Walt even included a dedication to his field day in the announcement, in his trademark idealistic, romanticized fashion.
Believe it or not, this is a day dedicated to the forgetting of sweat boxes, animation footage, and celluloids. It is my sincere wish that you enjoy yourself to the utmost, and that you will find the day one of complete pleasure and relaxation.
Relaxation was debatable, but complete pleasure was spot on.
For 2 years, all of us had been under terrible pressure, working long hours day and night to finish Snow White. When we arrived at the Narconian Hotel, there were pools to swim in, tennis courts, a golf course, live music, and plenty of food and alcohol, and something just snapped.
If the seeds of chaos were planted in the Norconian from the beginning, they didn't sprout until night. The day went just as planned, with pleasant games and activities between coworkers in the warm California sun. Roy would be present throughout the day, but Walt and Lillian wouldn't arrive until that night, as Walt was receiving an honorary master's degree from USC. Around 7, everyone gathered in the Great Hall for dinner. Walt himself finally showed, just in time to find his coworkers enjoying the open bar.
There was a lot of booze there, and it was evident.
Something snapped. Something just overcame everyone there. A strange mood of excitement.
I myself didn't stay. I left at sundown because I wasn't there with my wife. I had to come home.
After dinner, the dancing began as the drinks continued. Art and Marge Babbitt danced with their friends as Ward Kimball performed music with his gadget band.
It was real boisterous, and Ward Kimball had his Hugga GD8 or whatever he called his band.
At 11 p.m., there was a dance contest, judged by Isabel Bowen, Peggy Hughes, and oddly, Gunther Lessing, Disney's uptight lawyer. Walt was making the rounds and speaking with his friends and coworkers. Unbeknownst to him, a few of the animators were planning to pull a prank on their boss.
He was seated at a table with friends and family, and I made an arrangement with the policeman on duty there without Walt's knowledge. I told the policeman to go over there and tell him to quiet down, that he was making too much noise.
Well, by the time the guy finally showed up, Walt was so drunk himself that he kept arguing with the policeman and telling him that he was going to have his badge.
At 11:30 p.m., an awards ceremony was held, completing the planned activities for Walt's field day.
The event was very well organized by Hal Adelquist and his helpers, who arranged many activities for all to enjoy. Swimming, horseshoes, baseball, volleyball, touch football, aquaplaning, ping pong, and of course boozing. Handsome cups inscribed Walt's Field Day were awarded to the winners of these various events, except for boozing, and there were just too many competitors in that last event to declare a winner.
Walt would get up to speak during the awards ceremony. Multiple reports claim that, despite Walt expediting the Snow White bonuses, no official announcement had been made yet. Many of the animators expected that Walt would announce the bonuses in his speech, but he instead took the time to remind everyone of the work that they had ahead of them with the 2 new features. He ended his speech with no announcement of the bonuses, and many took this to mean that the party itself was the bonus. If this was the case, they were going to bleed Walt dry, and the most clear and fun way to do that was boozing. While technically Walt's field day ended at 11:59 p.m., the main event of the infamous party would start at midnight, as the animators rushed to the open bar to claim their bonus, before heading to the dance floor to do something unthinkable.
This dance we all did, it was called the Big Apple.
We were all doing the Big Apple.
In 1936, Billy Spivey, Donald Davis, and Harold Goo Goo Wiles, 3 white teenagers with era-specific names, were cruising down the streets of Columbia, South Carolina, when they noticed multiple people entering an old synagogue. As they approached, they could hear music blaring out of the building. It became clear to the 3 boys that they had stumbled upon a juke joint, an African-American nightclub. Davis in particular wanted to enter, so the 3 boys parked their car and walked up to the door. However, they were stopped before entering. The establishment, named the Big Apple Nightclub, was owned by Frank Fat Sam Boyd. Fat Sam told them that they could enter, but they must pay 25 cents each and only sit in the balcony. The boys agreed, and they hurried upstairs to watch the dance floor. What they saw blew their minds. Combining folk dancing and modern swing set to big band jazz, the nightclub guests were performing a new dance that the boys would refer to as the Big Apple. The boys tried to replicate the dance, but predictably, they weren't nearly as good at it, so they referred to their inferior version as the Little Apple. The boys would teach the dance to everyone they knew, and soon it was a certified dance craze. Its roots in African American culture were not forgotten, and many white people saw the dance as risque because of this. Such was the case when the Animators and their spouses danced the Big Apple in the Great Hall at the Norconian that night in 1938. But doing the Big Apple was just the start of the craziness.
The big picnic quickly got out of hand.
As the drinking continued, Walt decided that he and Lillian would retire to their hotel room and leave the Animators to continue the celebration. The party quickly moved from the Great Hall to the pools outside. The mingling between the ink and paint girls and the Animator boys intensified. The party split into smaller groups, performing hijinks around the property, some going to the pool and some going to the stables.
I got a little tipsy and I tried to ride the donkey. I didn't fall off, but I came close to it. Somebody got a picture of me 1 foot up in the air.
One of the animation boys was able to break a horse out of a stable, and in a drunken haze, he rode the horse into the hotel lobby, and reportedly up the stairs to the second floor, galloping the animal through the hallways as his drunken co-workers laughed and cheered him on. Having had way too much to drink, stumbled through a room and out onto a fire escape. Thinking he was on the ground floor, he kept going, falling 1 story to the ground.
Fred Moore fell out a window. It landed in a bush.
Freddie Moore walked off one of the upper floor balconies thinking he was on the ground floor and ended up in a tree, fortunately.
He luckily landed in a bush, wasn't hurt at all.
This would be one of the more memorable events of the night, and it would be immortalized by one of the artists in a comic depicting Fred's graceful fall. Over at the pool, the party was even crazier.
Everybody's drunk. Riley Thompson's riding a horse into a pool.
Apart from endangering innocent animals, the group by the pool was proudly ignoring Disney's memo about inter-office relations.
Somebody picked up an ink and paint girl and dumped her into the pool fully clothed, followed by others jumping in, and all hell broke loose pretty quickly. Swimsuits flew out the windows, there were naked swim parties, people got drunk and were often surprised what room they were in and who they were sleeping next to when they awoke the next morning. It was one hell of a party.
It was a wild party.
Walt was of course missing all of this, but he would be informed of the events soon enough. The party would continue well into Sunday morning, and the majority of the staff and studio management left the Norconian during the day on Sunday. Many, on the other hand, extended their stays, partying throughout Sunday and into Monday before making the drive to return to work.
People went up Friday night and came back Monday morning in some cases. I remember I went up early Saturday morning, very early, with a friend, and we stayed probably until the middle of the next night before we started home. It was about daylight when I got home, but that was a really great party.
Some reports claim that the choice to leave was not made by the Animators, but by the Norconian staff, who was ready to be rid of the partiers that had trashed the resort.
They kicked us all out of there. It was a disaster. They said, "We gotta get out of here. These degenerates are wrecking the place."
Walt was informed of many of the events of the party, whether by his fellow employees or by the Norconian staff.
Walt was horrified at the shenanigans. He and his wife drove home that next morning. He never referred to that party again. And in fact, if you wanted to keep your job, you didn't mention it either when you were working at the studio. We never had a party like that again.
Oh boy, Walt never did that again. I myself didn't stay. I left at sundown, but heard all about it later.
Oh, I didn't see any of those escapades. I never knew if it was true. I heard later that Walt was ashamed of that party, but he didn't act like it that night.
Many animators, even years later, were reluctant to discuss the events at Walt's field day at the Norconian, but the one thing that remains crystal clear is the cause of the wild party.
You know what it was. We were all tense because we've been working a lot of hours there on Snow White, and when we got through, everybody was ready to all hit the fan at once. Walt couldn't believe it. Had so many drunks in there. Well, they were all drunks.
After the party, everyone got back to their desks to churn out the 2 new features. Walt's passion was still high for Pinocchio and Bambi, but the success of Snow White had put an enormous pressure on the studio. Not only had Snow White been the first feature-length cell animated film, but it was also a great movie, with a strong story and endearing characters. Given Walt's perfectionism, Pinocchio and Bambi would have to be even better without the novelty of the format, and it was clear that there were issues with both films that would hinder this goal. The story team was making drastic changes to Pinocchio's source material, and Walt wasn't happy with the film's lead. Bambi's story as a whole wasn't working, and it was soon shelved in favor of Walt's new passion project, a segmented animated film set to classical pieces tentatively titled The Concert Feature. While Bambi was stalled, there were still a few storymen assigned to it, resulting in 3 feature films in production at once. By 1939, the studio would employ over 1,000 employees, and the company had long outgrown the studio on Hyperion Avenue. Walt would use some of the profits from Snow White to fund a new studio in Burbank, big enough to host the growing staff. Walt himself would be involved in the design process, optimizing the space for animation production. Walt soon became obsessed with designing the studio in an innovative and new way. The move would be completed in January of 1940. The transition to the new studio would not just be a physical moving of materials and personnel, it was a concrete signifier of a transformation in the studio's mindset. The fraternity was about to disband. The loss in a familial atmosphere at the studio might have been inevitable. The studio over tripled its staff in just 3 years, and it's difficult to form over 1,000 people into a cohesive family unit. Producing 2 features at once did not result in each animator doubling their workload. It meant that animators were split between projects, further segmenting the studio. All of the animators working on Snow White were driven by the project's novelty. However, having already achieved a hand-drawn feature film, there was no longer a bigger picture to work towards, and many animators wondered when, if ever, they would receive credit for their work. These were the inevitabilities of the situation, but the studio management certainly exacerbated the issue. Walt maintained his payment structure, in which he paid people what he thought they were worth and gave bonuses based on the quality of their work. In the beginning, animators on both ends of the pay scale agreed with this method, as they agreed with Walt's judgment in general. However, as the studio grew and new animators were brought in, Walt's time with each artist was significantly reduced. This was good in that it built Walt into even more of a character, as even a glance at the man was worth writing home about for new artists. On the other hand, the subjectivity of the pay scale was unsustainable. It was unclear what factors were being considered. In some cases it was seniority, in others loyalty, and of course talent and work ethic were being assessed, but the confusion resulted in the wages seeming random, or at the very least, based on Walt's favoritism. Rising from this frustration was Art Babbitt. Babbitt was one of the highest paid animators at the studio despite the contentious nature of his relationship with Walt. Despite his compensation and resulting luxurious lifestyle, Babbitt felt the need to take a stand for his coworkers. At the same time, the SCG, the newly formed Screen Cartoonist Guild, had partnered with nearly every major animation studio, and they were now headed for Disney. Walt was nervous. On one hand, he had maintained good wages and working conditions, even during the Great Depression, and compared to most studios, Disney was a paradise. At the same time, Disney's staff had grown so fast that he was not able to put his Uncle Walt charm on everyone, and the growing resentment of the wage gaps and his hogging of the spotlight was troubling.
Screen credits. That was one of the reasons why Walt didn't want to get involved with a union, and I thought they should. Walt didn't realize that this gives you a lot of pride. You get your name on it, you work harder. It all adds up.
All of this, combined with the rise in union organizing in the country in general, was enough to make Disney nervous. But Walt had made one clear mistake when designing the new studio, and it would not look good in a union fight. In hindsight, the name alone made studio management appear guilty.
The Penthouse Club, that was the dividing line. In Hyperion, they were all one happy family. Even though some of the guys were making $300 a week and deserved every dime of it, we were all there hoping to be animators. Then Walt was able to buy that property over in Burbank, which we all knew about, but then when he moved, that Penthouse Club...
The Penthouse Club was a private club on top of the animation building. It included a gym, a restaurant, a rooftop patio, a masseuse, a bar, and more. It also included beds, reportedly for animators that had too much to drink. At the entrance to the club was a mural painted by Fred Moore, featuring his famous naked ladies and a drunk man that many said resembled him. The most troublesome part of the club, apart from that, was its exclusivity. It was only made available to Walt's favorite animators. Not necessarily the best, not the hardest working, and in a few cases, not even the most loyal. The Penthouse Club was made for who other animators referred to as Walt's Boys. With the SCG closing in on Disney, partnering with Babbitt to recruit animators, Walt turned to his fixer, lawyer Gunther Lessing, for a plan. Reportedly, Lessing got in Walt's ear and planted a thought that would transform Disney's mindset. These animators, their concerns, their unions, they weren't loyal to Disney. They weren't his family or a fraternity. They were one thing: communists. This made perfect sense to Walt for many reasons. First, it was already the main rhetoric being used to combat the rise in unions at the time. Second, it absolved Walt of any guilt, as the only mistake he made was not squashing the communist infiltration in his own company, and it was definitely not that private gentleman's club that he built on top of the studio. Finally, Walt Disney loved America. and there was nothing less American in the eyes of America than communism. It didn't help that Walt was generally gullible when it came to politics.
Walt was a nice guy. Walt, in a way, was politically naive. He was wrapped up in his cartoons and animation, so he relied on what Gunther Lessing told him, and Gunther Lessing was a pack of lies. He fed Walt misinformation about the intentions of the Guild.
With the new narrative in place, Walt, Roy, and Lessing had no reservations about playing rough with those that wanted to form a union. To prevent union organizing, Walt increased the amount of police officers present at the studio. He also opened the Penthouse Club to anyone that could afford it, although due to its high membership fees, this ended up only being the people that were already invited. Babbitt continued to fight for his fellow animators, even approaching Roy about giving the ink and paint girls a raise.
You keep your nose out of our business, or we'll cut it off.
In a last-ditch effort to prevent the animators from forming a union, Walt held 2 large meetings in February of 1941 to present his case to his staff. He started the prepared speech strong by openly admitting that the studio was in a financial crisis, mainly due to the quick expansion, the box office failings of Pinocchio and Fantasia, and the loss of the foreign market due to World War II. He then announced that he would be laying off staff, as he felt that downsizing was the only way to avoid cutting everyone's pay. He then turned to the topic of those that wanted to join a union.
My first recommendation to the lot of you is this. Put your own house in order. You can't accomplish a damn thing by sitting around and waiting to be told everything. If you're not progressing as you should, instead of grumbling and growling, do something about it.
The speech was objectively terrible, and it actively convinced people that were indifferent to the idea of a union to join the cause. It was mainly filled with Walt asking for sympathy for his plights early on in forming the studio, and demanding that everyone be grateful to even be there. The inclusion of the line, "do something about it," was supposed to motivate harder work among the staff, but many believe that joining a union was doing something about it. Walt ended the speech in one of his less construction wall quotable moments.
Don't forget this. It's the law of the universe that the strong shall survive and the weak must fall by the way. And I don't give a damn what idealistic plan is cooked up. Nothing can change that.
The union continued to form, and Art Babbitt remained its head. Many questioned his motives for forming the union. Some believed it was out of the goodness of his heart. Others chalked it up to his performance nature. A few even suspected he was a communist plant or a puppet for a larger conspiracy. Babbitt would approach Walt multiple times, testing his patience as usual. On one occasion, Babbitt asked for a raise for his assistant, and Walt exploded.
Why don't you mind your own goddamn business? If he was worth it, he would be getting it.
I'll pay him myself.
The trouble with you is that you and your communist friends live in a world so small you don't know what's going on around you.
Babbitt didn't quit, and Roy was true to his word. On the day Babbitt was supposed to give a presentation to the labor board about the studio, he was arrested by the Burbank Police Department for having a concealed weapon, a stunt orchestrated by Lessing. Not even the arrest deterred Babbitt, who continued organizing at the studio. In May of 1941, Walt fired Babbitt, and Lessing instructed 2 studio guards to remove him from the premises. The arrest was in direct violation of the recent Wagner Act, which protected workers attempting to organize a union from termination. Walt, who had already fired more than 20 other defectors, didn't see any issue in firing the members of his staff that were complaining. In his view, he had to fire someone due to the cutbacks, so it might as well be the people that didn't like working there. The morning after Babbitt was fired, May 28, 1941, the Disney Animators strike began. The SCG had responded immediately and intensely, and a crowd of protesters, both Disney employees as well as other members of the union, picketed outside of the studio. What had once been a close-knit fraternity of boys that had pulled pranks on one another at the old studio and had partied together at the Norconian was now a divided group of men. Ward Kimball, who was torn between his relationship with Walt and his friends in the union, was confronted by Babbitt as he tried to enter the studio. Many friendships ended as the line between the strikers and the non-strikers was drawn. One thing both sides did agree on was that, given the animators' talent, the picket signs were very well done. Babbitt was in his element, pleading to the animators as they entered the studio to join the union. Eventually, Walt himself showed up to the scene, driving to the studio as Babbitt quickly grabbed a megaphone.
Walt Disney, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. There he is, the man who believes in brotherhood for everybody but himself.
Oh, you commie sons of bitches!
Walt got out of his car and ran up to Babbitt, holding his fists up as if to fight him. However, some witnesses claim that Walt wasn't actually going to strike Babbitt, and that he was half joking. It was a threat hidden within a joke, Walt's specialty. Throughout the strike, Walt surveyed his animators, organizing them into those that were with him and those that were against him.
We got the uneasy feeling that he was filing his feelings away in his prodigious memory for some future revenge.
The strikes were becoming increasingly hostile as the weeks went on. Strikers began slashing the tires on the cars of non-strikers, and the picketers became increasingly creative with their demonstrations and their depictions of Disney and Lessing. Fistfights broke out, and Walt phoned the Burbank Police Department, demanding 50 officers be placed at the studio at all times. After the department turned him down, Walt went ahead and hired 50 former police officers. Walt, on at least one occasion, would speed his car toward the protesters, slamming on his brakes just before hitting them. With escalating tensions, the federal government stepped in to force progress in the dispute. All targets were pointed at the studio. Soon, Bank of America, the studio's main creditor, was enlisted to pressure Disney to negotiate. This was the turning point, as the leverage the bank had over the studio was too large to ignore. On July 30th, Disney recognized the union and negotiations commenced. On September 16th, the studio officially reopened, with the animators continuing work on the Dumbo feature. Roy and Lessing began layoffs, letting employees go in a ratio approved in the strike negotiations. This resulted in a roughly equal number of strikers and non-strikers losing their jobs. The studio staff, which had almost reached 1,200 employees before the strike, had been nearly cut in half, now falling below 700 employees. Walt was here for none of this, both spiritually and physically. Just before the layoffs began, he, his wife Lillian, and a select few animators had taken off for South America on a goodwill tour of the continent. The US government was trying to stop the spread of Nazi influence, and Disney's popularity in the region led them to ask Walt if he would like to visit a few countries. Walt didn't want to do that and declined, until it was suggested that he use the opportunity to find artistic inspiration for animated films. The trip seemed even more lucrative when Walt took into account the fact that he could escape all of the issues at the studio and let Roy and Lessing deal with it on their own. When he returned, the studio in Burbank was far from the fraternity it was on Hyperion, and his attitude toward his staff was far from paternal.
His paternalism ended with the strike. He was never the same guy after that.
Disney never forgave and never forgot the animators that turned against him in the strike in 1941, harboring resentment and dishing out passive-aggressive retribution for decades to come. The stress and hurt of the strike had changed him, hardened him. His energy had decreased, and he spent less time with the animators. He had wanted to be his boys' mentor, their cool Uncle Walt, that taught them about hard work and pushed them to do their best. Instead, he had become like a stern college dean, ripe for a group of college kids to rebel against. From Walt's perspective, they were ungrateful children. He had worked tirelessly to create the studio, had taken on personal debt to fund the projects, had maintained incredible wages during the Great Depression, had the best working conditions in the industry, and had even built a brand new studio and designed it just for their needs. And they still had the audacity to defect to the union. Maybe things would have gone differently if Lessing had never gotten in Walt's ear, or if Walt was less stubborn, or if the studio had remained small and close. But it was too late. The fraternity was gone. Walt was left without a creative family, and while it would take him another decade, he would find another.